Hello, I'm Sarah and I work for Emerald Publishing. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. Firstly, I've got some housekeeping notes for everybody. All of your microphones are muted. You can submit questions for our speakers at any time during the webinar by typing them in the box marked questions, which you should see in the control panel at the side of your screen. We'll put your questions to our speakers later on in the event. We're here today to give you a taste of the analysis of global events that are provided by Expert Briefings and how you can use those in your teaching. We'll be using the impact of the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine to demonstrate the type of analysis that Expert Briefings gives you access to. Before I introduce our first speaker, here's what we'll be looking at today. First, we'll have a brief introduction to Oxford Analytica. They're the company who create the content in Expert Briefings. Then Joydeep Sen, a senior analyst at Oxford Analytica, will talk about the COVID vaccine rollout in the Asia Pacific region and globally. After that, Rachel Fitch, who is the product manager for Expert Briefings at Emerald, will give you a short tour of Expert Briefings on Cite and share some ideas for how you can use the product in your teaching. Finally, we'll put your questions to our speakers, so please submit those at any point during the webinar. So then, let's get started. Our first speaker is Dr. Joydeep Sen. Joydeep, as I mentioned, works for Oxford Analytica. He joined the company in July 2017, and he's their senior analyst covering South and Southeast Asia. Joydeep completed doctoral research and postdoctoral work on historical and contemporary South Asia at the University of Warwick, the University of Kent, and the University of Manchester. And during that time, he taught students at undergraduate and the postgraduate level. He's also worked as a political risk analyst on a freelance basis, and he was a research consultant for several international relations and development studies, worked on development studies projects relating to South Asia. Thank you for joining us today, Joydeep.
Well, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me and see me okay. Obviously, you've had a little introduction there to Oxford Analytica, but I thought I'd spend just 2-3 minutes introducing myself and saying a little bit about what we do. OA is indeed an independent geopolitical analysis and advisory firm. It draws on a global network of contributors as well as in-house expertise to advise clients about world events. So we try to identify risks and opportunities without veering into advocacy. So I'm part of the firm's analysis branch. Myself and 13 other analysts, along with the editor-in-chief, work on the firm's flagship publication, the Daily Brief. Most of the analysts cover a particular region, but a few have more of an international remit, focusing on themes such as international economy and cybersecurity. So I'm one of 2 analysts covering the Asia Pacific region. I focus on South and Southeast Asia, and my AP colleague handles East Asia. And as it happens, our North America analyst runs coverage of Australia and New Zealand. And the Daily Brief basically comprises 3 types of output. It's worth briefly describing them because you'll see a few examples drawn from the publication. So we have daily briefs or briefs. We have graphic analyses or GAs, and we also have executive summaries or execs. So briefs are the long pieces. They're about 1,200 words long. There are 6 or 7 each day. And brief is basically a co-production between an external contributor drawn from that global network that I was mentioning and an in-house analyst like myself. So the contributor provides copy, and the analyst's role is basically that of commissioning editor, content editor, and copy editor. And GAs, as the label suggests, are pieces where the analysis is presented graphically. So we've got an example from a few months back up on the screen at the moment. There are usually a couple each week. A GA may contain maps, charts, or various types of conceptual diagram. There's also a small amount of explanatory text. And execs are the short pieces. They're limited to 200 words. They usually reflect on something that has happened in the last 24 hours or 72 on a Monday. And I indeed tend to think of briefs as anticipating events or developments, and as execs as reacting to key news stories. So a brief's key takeaway appears in the what next section, whereas an exec concludes with a judgment paragraph. And really in all pieces, the aim is to provide independent, forward-looking, tightly written exposition that explains complex issues in simple language with accuracy. And like I said earlier, without advocacy. So naturally, we have, over the last year and a half, produced countless brief execs and GAs on various aspects of the COVID-19 crisis. And in recent months, a key focus of the coverage has been the rollout of vaccines, which is, of course, what we're here to talk about today. Most countries in South and Southeast Asia have begun inoculation programs. And during the next 15 minutes or so, I'll try to consider some of the political, economic, and social dynamics associated with this. So let's begin with South Asia, with India's rollout and its vaccine diplomacy. So India was in February, March, very much at the vanguard of vaccine diplomacy. Thereafter, as I'm sure everyone, even outside of India, knows, it came under huge pressure from a second wave of COVID-19 infections. So it effectively put its outreach on hold. Now, before the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, India was manufacturing about 60% of the world's vaccines. And by late March this year, it had shipped more than 60 million doses of locally made COVID-19 vaccines to dozens of countries in the form of commercial sales and grants. So its own vaccine rollout began in mid-January with 2 jabs. So one was the Oxford AstraZeneca shot, marketed locally as Covishield, which was and is being manufactured by the Pune-based Serum Institute of India. And the other jab is Covaxin, developed by the Hyderabad-based Bharat Biotech in conjunction with the Indian Council of Medical Research. Now, the second of those, Covaxin, was initially cleared for restricted use in clinical trial mode, but in mid-March, it was given the same level of authorization as Covishield. Now, most orders from abroad were for Covishield, and some countries were receiving Indian-made vaccines through the COVAX vaccine sharing initiative. So it's really important when we're talking about India not to confuse COVAX and Covaxin. Now, exporting vaccines helped India strengthen relations with countries around the world. So Delhi talked a lot about vaccine maitri or vaccine friendship. And what you see up on the screen now is a GA which I ran in early March. So obviously some of the data is now dated, but it hopefully just gives a little idea of the geographical extent of the outreach. Now, India's vaccine diplomacy was especially good for its regional ties. As you'll see, many doses were gifted and sold to other South Asian states. So COVID-19 vaccines made in India reached all of India's neighbors, barring Pakistan, which did not request them, more quickly and in greater numbers than donations from China. And the outreach resonated with the Prime Minister Narendra Modi's neighborhood first foreign policy. So the Modi government has come under a lot of pressure externally and domestically through this crisis for various reasons. But it is worth pointing out that it had long sought to champion a cooperative response to the COVID-19 crisis. So days after the World Health Organization declared the crisis a pandemic, the 8 countries of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, or SAARC, held a teleconference at the Indian Premier's behest to discuss the situation. So Modi at that time proposed establishment of an emergency fund to help the region's countries manage their outbreaks. And in some ways, the initial slowness of the rollout in India was helpful to Delhi's vaccine diplomacy because the country was able to export surplus stocks that might have otherwise expired. Now, the rollout from the outset faced logistical constraints in India, such as shortage of manpower and problems with the related hub. But another factor, perhaps, was the lack of confidence in Covaxin, especially among healthcare professionals. So it's worth highlighting that vaccine hesitancy is not necessarily the same thing as anti-vax sentiment. But a key reason for the success of India's vaccine diplomacy was maybe the shots involved. So Covishield, and for that matter, Covaxin, are for many countries preferable to jabs like Pfizer's because they're relatively affordable and they can be stored at temperatures of 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. So poor nations can use their existing immunization program cold chains for these COVID-19 vaccines imported from India. And Delhi was helping recipient countries train immunization and cold chain officers, and meanwhile exporting the jabs on commercial airlines and military aircraft. So that's, if you like, some of the upside to it. Obviously, this program ran into problems. So the last shipment of jabs abroad was on April the 22nd, according to the Ministry of External Affairs data. But actually, the pace of exports began to slow a few weeks earlier, as India came under pressure to keep aside increasingly scarce shots for its own population. Now, India was actually quicker than China or the United States to administer 100 million doses, but it's of course attempting to vaccinate a population of about 1.3 billion. So the last I checked, about 248 million Indians have received the first dose, and roughly 53 million a second. The rollout, which, as I said earlier, began in January, initially had a focus on people listed as high priority. Then all people aged over 45 became eligible for inoculation from the start of April. And then all people aged over 18 became eligible from the start of May. And it looks like the government now wants all adults vaccinated by the end of the year. Now, domestic manufacturers have not managed to scale up vaccine production at the rate they envisaged. So the Serum Institute, for example, was making about 70 million Covishield doses per month by January. It did plan to increase that to 100 million by March, but as far as I know, it's yet to do so. Now, the Serum Institute's chief executive had long warned that US export restrictions were causing a shortage of raw material for jabs. I will talk a little bit more about India-US ties amid this crisis later, but it's important to point out that Washington has now lifted some of these curbs, so this should help ease the supply chain bottlenecks. And separately, the government has made an advance payment to the Serum Institute and Bharat Biotech to help them increase manufacturing. But it's still going to be a massive challenge to do so. And besides ramping up production, I think imports will be key for India. So India expects to receive AstraZeneca shots from the United States. And regulators have also approved Russia's Sputnik 5. So this is a third jab that is now in the vaccine portfolio. So the first imports of this vaccine arrived a few weeks ago, and India is also set to manufacture the jab. India has said that it will fast-track emergency approval for vaccines manufactured and cleared by regulators in the United States, United Kingdom, the EU, and Japan. So the firms making these jabs will not have to undertake local safety trials. And more generally, just diverging from the issue of vaccines specifically, India will in the short term be more receptive to offers of foreign aid than it has been in recent years. So it will probably underscore that it's not appealing for such assistance. But in the light of the current situation, it probably feels that it must be pragmatic. So in recent weeks, India has relied on imports of medical oxygen as well as vaccines. Several hospitals, of course, have reported a shortage or even expiry of supplies. But I think Delhi will eventually return to the vaccine diplomacy it was engaging in earlier, although it will, of course, be under pressure to ensure that it's prioritizing its own population's needs. I think India will hope to receive more orders for Covaxin. There is such a thing as vaccine nationalism, but it can mean different things in different contexts. And in India, it may be more about promoting its homegrown jab. And generally, the country's vaccine diplomacy did bring it a certain amount of goodwill. Indian exports helped many countries, especially in the neighborhood, at least start their rollouts. The situation, of course, changed. The country was forced to attend to its growing crisis. And that's been a source of some controversy. There's been a lot of media reports about how other countries have responded to that. I think for the most part, most erstwhile recipients of vaccines recognize that India had a crisis to deal with, so they were loath to criticize Delhi. and partly because they knew that they may rely on Indian exports again in the medium term. But to now get into some of the interesting geopolitics around this, India's break on sales and grants of COVID-19 vaccines abroad would prompt many of its neighbors, not just Pakistan, to rely more on shots from India's strategic rival, China. So if we could move to the next slide. This is a GA which I ran towards the start of this month, and gives a little bit of an idea of the outbreaks in South Asia and how they've been intensifying, and some of the relative efforts of India and China in distributing vaccines in the region. As you can see, I mean, all the countries in the region will be under pressure to accelerate their rollouts. And I think certainly Bangladesh and Nepal and Sri Lanka will likely step up procurement from Beijing. And this will inevitably raise concerns about whether China is using vaccines as leverage in negotiations over things like infrastructure agreements and financial assistance. I think China's vaccine deals will not necessarily involve direct quid pro quos, but obviously it's something that that people will be talking about. And as the graphic shows, China's been a key supplier to Pakistan. And I think there's an interesting thing to say here about India-Pakistan relations through this crisis, because actually there may be scope for India and Pakistan to cooperate more in the fight against this pandemic. So in late February, the two countries recommitted to a 2003 ceasefire at the line of control, which is the de facto border in Kashmir. I mean, this probably came after months of back-channel talks. It's important to highlight that similar resolutions have been made in the past and not held, and the agreement certainly does not portend peace. But the development at least paves the way for the two countries to work together more than they have done in recent years. So there may be revival of cross-border trade to some extent, increased data sharing on transboundary rivers. In short, a few confidence-building measures. And vaccine diplomacy could be a part of that. I mean, Pakistan, for its part, recently offered aid, and Delhi probably draws the line at accepting such offers from Islamabad. But before India reined in its vaccine exports, Pakistan was anyway set to receive Indian-made jabs through COVAX. So at some point in the near future, there may be more direct outreach from Delhi, although probably not in the immediate term. So let's move on now to Southeast Asia, i.e. the ASEAN states. Here too, the China factor is very important because among external players supplying jabs to the region, I think China will probably gain the most money and influence, despite local reservations about its shots. Now, in recent months, the region has received jabs manufactured in India and Russia and the West, as well as in China. But China's role, I think, is going to increase. I mean, all Southeast Asian states are trying to secure enough vaccines as they battle upsurges in their COVID-19 outbreaks. In 2020, several Southeast Asian countries won external praise for their responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, but this year, much of the region has been hit by second or third waves of infections. And as per the official data, at least, it looks like COVID-19 has spread more widely in mainland Southeast Asia, although case numbers are still significantly lower than those in the maritime ASEAN states. Now, public support for inoculation varies across the region. Attitudes are likely influenced by confidence in government-led programs and data on the efficacy of specific vaccines. If we go to the next slide, I think this should be a graphic from a brief which I ran towards the end of last month. So again, please do note that this is from late May, and it shows cases per million people. So it's an effort to try and show the relative burdens across the countries in a more comparative light. So it shows how a lot of the country's regions have been battling intensifications in their outbreaks. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see some of the progress that the countries of the region have made in their rollouts. Again, this is from late May, so all of the countries are now further down the line. Singapore, for example, has now given a first dose to over half the population, and over a third is fully vaccinated. But the general pattern is roughly the same still. Now, Indian-made vaccines, mainly Covishield, reached Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos in January to March. And India's suspension of jab exports is definitely going to affect certain Southeast Asian vaccine programs, as some of the region's countries have placed orders with Delhi. So like I was saying, Delhi is going to benefit from the pause Beijing is going to benefit from the pause in Delhi's vaccine diplomacy. Many Southeast Asian countries are including the relatively cheap jabs made by China's state-owned Sinopharm and the Beijing-based Sinovac in their vaccination programs. China does face a challenge to overcome growing resistance to its outreach among local populations. So many people in the region question the efficacy of Chinese vaccines, partly because of the certain lack of transparency over trial results. And of course, there are broader geopolitical tensions at play. Now, things may be mitigated somewhat by the World Health Organization validating the Sinopharm and Sinovac shots for emergency use. So that move may even allow those vaccines to be distributed through COVAX. And I think China will probably end up as a key vaccine supplier to Myanmar, where the junta is relying strongly on Beijing's support. But separately, many Southeast Asian states have chosen to procure Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, and AstraZeneca jabs from Western manufacturers. And Thailand is now key to AstraZeneca's plans to distribute its vaccine across the Asia-Pacific region. So Siam Bioscience, which is owned by the monarchy, is producing the firm's shots locally, although historically it's been short on jab-making experience. There is some public disquiet about the slow pace of production, but Bangkok has denied blocking exports. And it's also important to point out that Washington and Moscow will each step up its vaccine diplomacy in Southeast Asia. So earlier this month, shortly after the Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, became the highest ranking official in President Joe Biden's administration to travel to the region, the United States announced that it would donate unused COVID-19 vaccines to Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. And Southeast Asia will be a priority region. There'll be a particular focus on states that currently have low vaccination rates. And about 75% of the vaccines that Washington now plans to donate overseas are earmarked for developing countries through COVAX. I also mentioned Moscow. I think the quantity of Russian-made jabs in Southeast Asia and South Asia, for that matter, will increase. And several Asia-Pacific countries already include Sputnik 5 in their vaccine portfolios. So just to give a little indication of where different countries in the region lie at the moment and their prospects, I think Singapore, closely followed by Vietnam, will be the quickest among ASEAN countries to achieve widespread vaccination against COVID-19. Perhaps that's stating the obvious. I mean, the city-state, which is the region's top performer with respect to coronavirus vaccination to date, should achieve widespread vaccination by early 2022. And I think Vietnam will likely accelerate its inoculation program and catch up by the middle of next year, despite its slow start. The reality is that most of the region will struggle to reach the same stage before 2023, maybe even 2024. I mean, Vietnam's relatively low case tally may be one reason why it has lacked urgency with its rollout. But also Vietnam and Singapore are developing their own vaccines. Vietnam expects to have about 4 ready by the last quarter of this year. Singapore's homegrown jab is still in clinical trials. Now, I said earlier that China will be a key supplier to Myanmar, but I think clearly Myanmar's outlook is pretty bleak in the wake of the recent coup. with health workers joining anti-junta strikes and several doctors currently in detention due to their participation in protests, the country is unlikely to have the capacity to run a comprehensive vaccination scheme. And there's a few other interesting political dimensions to mention. For example, pandemic-related emergencies in Malaysia and Thailand are helping under-pressure leaders strengthen their governing control. So in April, the Thai Prime Minister, Prayut Chan-o-cha, assumed heightened governing authority. Certain ministerial powers were transferred to him on the pretext of the country's ongoing pandemic-related emergency. Now, with increased surveillance and censorship, his administration is clearly better placed to face down the long-running protest movement against it. And as for Malaysia, the emergency, which was declared by the King in January on government advice, is scheduled to last until August. But there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. Is it going to be extended? Now, the emergency has enabled the Prime Minister, Muhyiddin Yassin, to suspend Parliament and fend off challenges to his leadership from within his governing coalition and the opposition ranks. So a lot of interesting developments to follow there. And I thought I'd just finish with a few words about the Quad, just to expand on the geopolitical dimensions here. So when India revives its vaccine diplomacy, as I think it will, its ties with Quad partners, including Washington, will be a key factor. So for those who don't know, the Quad is a security grouping which comprises Japan and Australia, as well as India and the United States. So it emerged from a dialogue that was held in 2007. And what each of the members has in common is that they're all wary of China's growing power. Now, the Quad only had its first ministerial meeting in 2019, and it had its first summit in March this year. And as it develops, it's increasingly likely to focus on matters beyond traditional security issues. So, for example, at the March summit, the leaders of the 4 countries talked about ways to support India's vaccine manufacturing. India was at the time the one Quad member engaging in vaccine diplomacy. And I think its partners recognize that backing its efforts could help the group push back on China's regional influence. So the 4 sides established a scheme to help expand Indian vaccine production. And this involves the Hyderabad-based Biological E producing the US-developed Johnson & Johnson shot. Now, the main financing for this is slated to come from the United States and Japan, while Australia is meant to use its logistical strengths to ship the jabs to countries across the Indo-Pacific. So this should complement Washington's recently announced plans about vaccine donation in Southeast Asia. Now, India's difficulties in managing its second wave of infections clearly exposed some fault lines in Delhi-Washington and Delhi-Canberra ties, somewhat undermining the Quad and thereby providing something of a propaganda victory for Beijing. The United States was keen to underscore that it hadn't banned exports of raw materials for jabs. As I said earlier, the chief of the Serum Institute had adverted to this problem. Washington was pointing out that all countries are struggling to manage limited resources. And the reality is that the world was and is producing vaccines at a rate far above what it would do normally. So resources are indeed scarce. But clearly Washington's messaging or lack thereof during India's crisis was surprising. It did remedy that, or it has remedied that more recently. Separately, Canberra's India travel ban caused some consternation. So Australia temporarily outlawed any entry from India, including by its own returning citizens. So it was a point of contention. But these issues are unlikely to set back Quad ties in the long run. I think collaboration over vaccine production is going to be a key plank of the group's agenda. More broadly, the group may not grow in numbers, but it certainly will become more important. It's not going to become an alliance, not least because of India's insistence on strategic autonomy. India does alignment, but not alliances. with a quad will expanded remit, like I said earlier, covering non-traditional security issues. And clearly vaccine diplomacy, maybe one of the first major initiatives to this end. So I'll leave it there, and maybe we'll come back to some of these themes in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joydeep, for that. That was incredibly informative, and I'm sure everybody, all of our attendees on the line, found it absolutely fascinating as well. If you do have any questions for Joydeep, don't forget you can drop them in the questions panel, which should be over on the side of your screen. We'd love to hear them, and we can put them to him a little bit later on in the webinar. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague Rachel Fitch. She's the product manager for Expert Briefings at Emerald, and she's going to show you a little bit about how you access Expert Briefings on Emerald Insight, and also talk to you about some ideas for use in teaching. So I'll hand over to Rachel.
Lovely, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Joydeep, for sharing your insight and analysis into the vaccine rollout in your region. Very insightful, thank you. As Sarah mentioned at the start of today's webinar, Emerald licensed the daily briefing content from Oxford Analytica, and we deliver this via our global platform and to our global network of customers, of academic customers. So something we often get asked by our customers is, why should I use Expert Briefings in my teaching? Next slide, please. Thank you. Expert Briefings can help develop students' core skills. So in academic writing, it's all about showing what you know, but in the world of work, concise, accurate and relevant information is key. Expert Briefings present key information in context and in clear and simple language. And using them gives us great preparation for applying your learning in the real world. For example, in a business strategy class, you could ask students to imagine they represent a company thinking about opening an office or a factory in a particular company. Throughout the month, students can use Expert Briefings to assess and report back to the class on opportunities and threats. Next slide, please. They help inspire tomorrow's decision makers. So Oxford Analytica's daily brief format was first developed to get US presidents quickly up to speed with the most important local and global events each day, which I think Joydeep has demonstrated to us through his talk about the vaccine rollout in his region. Now the company's content is used by governments and business leaders around the world, and we're bringing the content to academia. An example of how this would work, we could use this in class, is to have students read one of the daily brief articles, which are approximately around 1,200 words, and use this as a basis for classroom discussion, enabling them to try their hand at making decisions world leaders are facing right now. Next slide, please. They also help keep teaching fresh and relevant. So by always having up-to-date real-hand examples to show your students and demonstrate theories and concepts in action. So they help make it easy to find content on current events to use in your teaching. You can bring in new examples daily or weekly, and you can use the brief to update your lecture slides and reading lists throughout the year to reflect and to reflect relevant current events. The longer briefs make a perfect supplement to core reading lists to bring students up to date. Next slide, please. And news and media often neglect topics at the core of business and international relations, and you might struggle to find content on some regions and countries. Because Expert Briefings content is made for decision makers in government and business, it doesn't ignore these topics. Users often tell us that they find content in Expert Briefings that they couldn't find anywhere else. So I'm now going to demonstrate the product on our platform. So if we select Browse Content from the top navigation bar and select Expert Briefings from the menu, so we're presented with our homepage for the Expert Briefings product. The page itself, you can see and access the latest daily briefings. So this is content that was published yesterday, and you can also choose here to sign up and stay up to date with Expert Briefings content that's applicable if you're a subscriber to Expert Briefings, whereby you get a daily update on content that's been published. So for the purpose of this, you can search in the search term here to view Expert Briefings, or you can click here and view all Expert Briefings. For the purpose of the demonstration, I'm going to use the click here to view all Expert Briefings. So we can see the briefings are presented in publication date order, and we can see here briefings published from yesterday. New content goes live every day in the afternoon. So from this page, we can also filter by year, so by date, by content type. As Joydeep explained earlier, the executive summary is a very short snapshot of the daily brief itself, and then the graphic and analysis. Again, Joydeep used some of these examples within his analysis from earlier. So if we click here, we can present all briefings that were published in the last month. If we click on country, we can provide briefings specific to a country. So here we can select and choose India, for example. And it will present all briefings from India that have been published since the content went live on the platform. Under the details section, we can see here keywords associated with this brief. So geographic keywords and topical keywords. This enables us to then search further into any of the keywords associated with this briefing or another briefing. For example, if we click on telecommunications, we'll get a number of briefings in India talking about telecommunications. We can clear these filters, which will bring us back to our original search page, where we can look at content in more detail. So if we look by content type, this gives us the expert briefing, so the longer form briefing. And just to show you what this looks like. So the longer form briefing talks about the significance of the events, the impact of the events, the analysis, and then provides us with a conclusion and a forward-looking what's next prediction from Oxford Analytica. And again, here we can see the keywords related with this article. There's also citation information. So from an academic perspective, it's easy to cite the source for the research or for students. We can also see other related articles, so enabling us to very quickly search and find content that might help support our argument or help us find out more information about a specific topic. And if I go back to the briefing, we can look at, again, remove the filter and look at those other types of briefings. So we've got the executive summary, which is a very short snapshot of an event or a follow-up to a previous briefing. And we can look again at the graphical analysis, which really condenses and distills the information into very easy to use, digestible graphics, which visually can help make content a bit more impactful. And you can zoom in on this information. Except it's going very slow this morning. We can use the advanced search functionality on the right-hand side here. And if we click Expert Briefings, enter our term, say for example, pandemic, select our date range, it will bring back all expert briefings relating to the pandemic. And we can change those and sort those by the publication date. And at any time, we can just go back to our homepage and back to the full list of expert briefings content. I think that concludes my demonstration of the site. I hope you found it useful. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. That was a great demo. Hopefully people found that useful and understand a little bit more about how the product works now. So as promised, now we're going to have a chance for you to put your questions to Joydeep and to Rachel as well. We've had some really great questions coming in, and my colleague Disha is going to moderate the Q&A for us.
Thank you, Sarah. It's been an amazing session so far, and we've got a couple of questions. The first question is for Joydeep. It says that, can we use expert briefings for literature review? And also, how can we use expert briefings in a research paper?
Interesting questions. When you say use expert briefings in literature review, is there any elaboration on that, or?
No, it's just a way that an article is written. So if a person is reviewing or is how do I say, is doing research, and it's a particular topic, and they go back and they're trying to read a lot of literature on it, and they are giving their conclusions on it. So they're just saying, if they're doing a literature review paper or an article which is a literature review, then can we use expert briefings within that? And if yes, and also how they can use expert briefings in a research paper. If they are writing any research, how can they use expert briefings within that?
Okay. I mean, in terms of citation and so forth, maybe Rachel would be able to answer that better. But certainly, I would hope that the content that we produce can be used in literature reviews. Certainly, it's always possible to cite pieces by Oxford Analytica. In terms of what's in the actual pieces, we don't carry references or footnotes, for example, so it's not necessarily going to help you expand your literature search. But certainly in terms of thematic and conceptual content, yeah, I hope it can be useful. And in terms of how you use it, I mean, I guess it depends very much on the disciplinary background you're from and what you're looking to publish. I mean, the emphasis in our content, like I said, is very much on forward-looking analysis. So I do know that a lot of clients and subscribers like to use the Daily Brief archive. So it's very interesting for them to see how we have covered topics in the past, for example. But obviously, the emphasis in what we're doing is very much on trying to look forward. So whenever we, in a particular piece, deal with historical context, we try to keep that quite short and spend a little bit more time thinking about how things might play out. And the other thing to point out, I think, is that although we are a political risk consultancy, and people are looking for forecasts, in many ways, I think the value of the output is not necessarily in giving a prediction as such. It's simply in trying to explain complex political, economic, and social themes in as simple a way as possible, and making it intelligible. So in many ways, it's about providing education on a particular country or region as much as giving a forecast as to what's literally going to happen next.
Right. So we have one question. I think, Rachel, you might be able to pick that up. They're saying that can we use expert briefings in any subject course that we teach?
Absolutely. I think that's the key, is that expert briefings covers such a wide geopolitical spectrum that it's relevant for all sorts of different courses and disciplines within an academic environment.
Right. So Joydeep, the next question is to you. They say that there are many sources already available regarding COVID-19 everywhere in the world, including media, social media platforms, official government websites. How is expert briefing content different in comparison to other mediums?
What I think is one of the best analogies we use here at OA is that we're trying to discern the signal from the noise. So obviously there's a lot of information and analysis out there, like you said, from government sources, from academia, from the media, and really we're trying to filter that and really pick up on the essential takeaways. So I think really that's the key value that these briefings provide, that we're not trying to capture everything. We really are just trying to zero in on what is of analytical interpretive value. And yes, we of course do ourselves draw on a lot of the sources in putting out the content. As I said at the outset, we not only have this in-house team, we're also drawing on this network of external contributors. So we really are trying to use insights from as broad a range of disciplinary backgrounds and geographical locations as possible to hopefully get insights from on the ground, if you like.
Right. Thank you so much. Rachel, the next question is for you. How do I cite expert briefings in my research?
How do you cite? Sorry, you broke up, Disha.
Yeah, sorry. How do you cite expert briefings in my research?
So the citation information is all available on the Insight platform.
All right.
I think I demonstrated it earlier on in the demonstration. I can share my screen again and show you, and then it's possible also to download that information.
Right.
Would you like me to share?
Yeah, why not?
Bear with me. So if we find a briefing, the citation information is available here when you drill actually into the briefing itself, and is located here. Very easy to copy. Is that okay?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Joydeep, the next question is for you. It may be a bit long, so please do bear with me. The question is that we've seen that the White House has also joined in the vaccination diplomacy by announcing that the US will donate approximately 7 million doses for countries such as Asia, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Thailand, the Pacific Islands, and so on. So what do you interpret it as? Do you interpret it as a competition of the vaccine donation between superpowers like China and US, or how do you see it?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, clearly there is an element of geopolitical rivalry here. So, what I say about this is that, no country does something for nothing. So, we were often asked this a lot about India's outreach, for example, during that February, March, April period. And of course, partly this is, for all these countries, a commercial bet. So I think for India and China, commercial sales are much more significant than donations, for example. But like I was saying, it's also about earning goodwill. So it's about both things. It's about money and influence. And yes, to date, maybe the United States hasn't been such a prominent player within this vaccine diplomacy game, certainly in comparison with India, China, and Russia. But yes, that is going to pick up now. I think that is pretty clear. I mean, to date, a lot of countries have been placing orders with Western firms without necessarily a government push behind that, if you see what I mean. So, for example, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia have been procuring Pfizer, Moderna, jabs, AstraZeneca, not from India, but from Western sources. And that's not necessarily because these Western governments have been pushing it. It's just happened. But now I think, yes, there will be, more of a concerted drive. We're seeing that from the United Kingdom as well as the United States, I think. But in the US context, I do think the Quad is going to be key to this. So like I mentioned at that March summit, this grand plan for distributing jabs throughout the Indo-Pacific was a very important part of the talks that the four leaders held. And although India's problems with ramping up manufacturing are clearly a setback to an extent, I think certainly later in the year, those Quad ties are going to be key to India ramping up its own production and then distributing vaccines again throughout the region. So yes, I think the US is going to be a more important player in this respect.
So just to follow up from this, we have another question that that intertwines with this, is that how likely is it that we will be back to normal, across regions by the end of the year?
Oh gosh, I mean, that's a very big question. I think clearly, I mean, to state the obvious, it varies from country to country, region to region. I'm not sure that there is any such thing as reverting back to normal. Of course, the phrase we all hear all the time is the new normal. That obviously means different things in different contexts. I don't think many countries will be in position to say that they're completely in control of the situation even by the end of this year. Obviously, some countries are very close to achieving fairly comprehensive vaccination, but there will be further waves of infection. There are new variants, of course, appearing, and there are always questions about the efficacy of vaccines against those new variants. And of course, 2 jabs might not be the end of the story. We might all need boosters. So clearly, this is something that is going to run. And I certainly wouldn't say that any part of the world is going to be back to what used to be normal by the end of this year.
So we hope that it will get better.
Certainly, we hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. Rachel, the next question is for you. The question is, do expert briefings only, are towards the business and the political events, or do they cover other topics as well?
They cover a myriad of topics, from political events, social, economic events, supply chain. If users want to go and search on our website, there's some very good information on the Emerald Publishing Group website about expert briefings and the kind of things that it covers. Topics such as climate change, for example. COVID has obviously been a big geopolitical topic that has been covered, certainly over the course of the pandemic. So it's from industry. Sorry, Disha.
No, sorry. I just said it's extremely broad.
It's very broad.
Thank you. The next question is to you as well.
I think
the question is, sorry, Joydeep, please.
No, I was just going to add to that. I think, in fact, that's one of the USPs of Oxford Analytica, that we cover everything. So a lot of political risk consultancies tend to focus very much on political and certainly economic issues, but we cover the broad spectrum of things, so political, economic, social, and even various industries. And certainly, when the COVID-19 crisis began, obviously it was dominating coverage. And then for a while, it seemed that we were, mentioning, the new normal, it seemed that we were going back to the sort of coverage that we were doing earlier and covering, a wider spectrum of themes. And now at the moment, it seems to be very prominent in coverage again. But yes, this is one of the key things about OA, I think, that we do cover everything.
Yeah. I think, yeah, the next question is very important. Rachel, I think you should be the one to pick this up. Will there be no plagiarism cases if we use expert briefings in researches like thesis or dissertations?
No plagiarism. That in itself is a very broad and interesting topic. I guess it's all about citing the information and using it within research or within academia and making sure that the information is cited predominantly. Plagiarism is, I guess, we monitor it through our research output. And in terms of using the information, we've seen how it's possible to use expert briefings content within academic research, and it's all about applying the principles that you would to any other research paper, theses, etc. So I think broadly the principles are the same as whether you're using a journal article, case content, newspaper article, any content that you're citing to support your argument.
Yeah, we should be able to cite it correctly to make sure that, yeah, right. The next question is, I think either of you can take this up. The decision to return or not is no longer just about workplace safety. Hybrid workforce models have become part of the organizational fabric. Are employees as productive as before COVID-19?
That's quite broad, isn't it? I think it depends on the organisation you work for and the perspective. From an analytical perspective, Joydeep, do you have anything to bring to that argument, that conversation?
Well, yeah, I think in many ways you could argue that the shift to remote working has prompted employees perhaps to spend more time doing work. So it's definitely changed the work-life balance. There's a lot of questions, I guess, about the boundaries between home life and work life. And another thing I think worth pointing out, and this is especially relevant to debates about lockdown policies, for example. A lot of governments come under criticism if they don't lock down, for example, because there's a suggestion that they're putting livelihoods ahead of lives. But of course, in most parts of the world, the economy is fundamentally about people trying to stay alive. It's not just becoming rich. And it is important to bear in mind that doing what we're doing now is not something that a lot of people can do by way of earning a living. So I think policymakers, opinion makers, academics, analysts, journalists, we can all work online and we can all think about these hybrid work models. But for the bulk of the workforce in most parts of the world, it really doesn't work like that. So these sorts of issues, of course, are very important, but they don't necessarily bear much relation to the vast majority of workers.
I think as a global business, Emerald have certainly benefited. So from personal experience, it means that our global colleagues probably feel more involved in the business, more engaged. I think that's had a very positive impact for our customers and our employees. So I think it depends on the organisation very much.
I've just had a look at the clock and we've been having such an interesting conversation, but I've realized that we're running out of time. I'd like to invite Sarah to please come, and we've come an end to our question and answer session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks Joydeep, Rachel and Disha as well. That was a really fascinating discussion, and I'm so sorry that we didn't get through everybody's questions. We've had more coming in the last sort of 15 minutes, some really great questions there. Thank you so much for coming and attending today. We hope that you've found it interesting. Just to let you know that there will be a recording available. A few people have asked about that. You'll get a link to that in an email that you'll receive in about 24 hours time. That email will also have a link to a certificate of attendance for you, and there'll be some information there about how you can sign up to our monthly free pick, which is an email you get into your inbox every month where you get 4 completely free expert briefings and also some ideas for how you use it in teaching as well. So once again, thank you so much for being with us today. Thanks and goodbye.